Hello, everyone. I need to put this warning out before starting the podcast for this week. As always, I wanted to try to talk about the game in a way to where you reveal the plot as it's revealed in the course of the story and not spoil end game events at the beginning of the discussion. However, for this particular game, that's very difficult to do. It's very difficult to talk about the development history without doing that. It's very difficult to kind of skip over really important points to discuss and explain without doing that. So for this game in particular, I think it's important that you first beat the entire game before you come in and watch this podcast. So I want to give that as an official spoiler warning for this video. If you have not played Hellblade, you need to do that first before watching this. It's only about 6 to 8 hours. It's a very short game, but go ahead and beat that first and then return. That way, nothing will be spoiled for you. Okay, with that out of the way, please enjoy this week's podcast. Welcome back to the State of the Arc podcast. My name is Mike.
My name's Kason.
Today we are covering Senua's Sacrifice. Hellblade, Senua's Sacrifice. This was initially supposed to be a one-off episode. We were just going to cover it in one episode.
Yeah.
Then I took like 13 pages of notes.
Just start reading.
It's a short enough game. You could beat it
like 7 or 8 hours.
If you wanted to in one sitting if you had like a weekend.
Weekend.
Just a lot of time on your hands or something.
Yep.
It's one of those games you can beat quickly. So there's not like a huge volume of story to cover, but it is dense. And there is a lot of things you can miss. This is your first time.
Yeah, it's my first time playing the full game, yeah.
So
yep.
I realized in talking to you, but also in the fact that I've now played this is probably my fourth time playing it.
Oh, nice.
That, like, going back to my first time, it's like, yeah, because the story is so non-linear in how it's delivered, it's almost requires like a second playthrough
to actually really get the story.
I see how that's piecing, because you know where it's going, and so it's easier to like remember or retain the information.
Yeah.
So maybe play it twice if you like it. It'll help with some of that. But this is one of my favorite games ever. I think that it is thematically just insanely ambitious for the size of the team that worked on it. I think that it has a really incredible central message. And it's one that really touched me. And so I'm very excited to jump in and talk about it. But it is dense, so this will probably be 2 episodes, at least. Oh, another thing. I know there are some people who appreciate a longer, like 3-hour podcast or something like that. It's not feasible for us to keep doing that. It's not only just the workload is a lot more, but we run out of space on our SD hard drives, SSD hard drives. We have 500 gigabyte SSD hard drives.
Yes.
And Kason couldn't
one
fit
episode.
the final episode of Final Fantasy Tactics on that. That's how large these files are.
It was in part because it was a 4-hour.
Because it was 4 hours long.
4 hours, yeah. So we'll be splitting that one up into 2 episodes.
Yes. But additionally, I just think it's, I don't know. Moving forward, we're going to try and have a really hard limit on about that 1.5 hour line. So things might end up being a few more episodes because of that. We won't try to blow through a game like Final Fantasy Tactics in 5 episodes next time.
Yeah.
But we don't want to go too far beyond 8 or 10 either. So
exactly. Yeah.
We're still trying to refine this process and figure out the sweet spot. So this one will probably end up being 2 episodes.
Okay.
if you're new to our podcast, I do this every time that we start a new game, because there's going to be kind of new people coming in who maybe haven't seen us before. We try to handle this podcast a little bit like a book club for video games. So it's meant for you to kind of play along with us. I think a good place, what I'm expecting to happen is that in this first episode we'll play up to the point where Senua is crossing the bridge into Helheim.
Oh, there, okay.
So after having faced Valravn
And the fire.
and Surtr, those two gods, and like getting the seal broken that opens the door into Helheim. I'm expecting, because we'll be covering development history today, that we'll probably get about that far.
Okay.
And then in the second episode, we'll cover the rest of the game, plus some, maybe some like addressing some controversy surrounding Hellblade a little bit. So that's kind of how I'm thinking about breaking this up. So for this episode, we're going to go all the way up to that point after Valravn and Surtr, and then the next episode will cover the rest of the game. So that's where you should play up to for this episode. If you've not played up to that, do so first. Otherwise, you will be getting spoiled for that portion of the game. But first, we like to talk about development history, because in order to understand and sort of fairly critique, a game like this, it's good to understand the intention behind it, what the developers were thinking of, what their goals were, what their ambitions were, what they were trying to achieve, and then sort of seeing, did they deliver on those things, right?
I think that's good.
Yeah.
They're actually pretty explicit in what
Yes.
they were trying to achieve, because as you first start playing the game, there's a screen that shows.
Yeah.
And it has a website to go to, and it tells you exactly what this game was trying to do.
Yeah.
And so it's more explicit than most games we play.
I always like doing like dev history, our opening dev history episode, because I'll always find little nuggets where this thing is connected to something else that I had no idea it was connected to. So let's just jump into that real quick. So Ninja Theory is the development studio behind Hellblade. A lot of people have probably heard the name Ninja Theory for like DMC, Devil May Cry, which was sort of a reboot of the Devil May Cry series, was made by Ninja Theory. It was a very controversial Devil May Cry title.
Is that the one where he's like naked?
Yes, that's the one. He has like that black short hair, and they sort of like reimagined.
That trailer was so funny, because there was always like something conveniently right in that area.
A pizza
throughout
slice.
Throughout the whole trailer. It was so funny.
Yeah, so that title was one of their big ones, but also Heavenly Sword. I don't know if you ever played that game.
I can't.
Weta Digital and Andy Serkis were very involved
way.
in the motion capture and animation for that game. It was a really cool PS3 title. I really liked that game back in the day. It was not a big commercial success, but so they've had a couple of games like that. But Hellblade was their first like real financial success.
Yeah.
But when the company was founded, they weren't known as Ninja Theory. They were known as Just Add Monsters. That was like the original name.
Okay.
So there were three people who sort of founded this company. Tamim Antoniades, who is the director of Hellblade and the writer of Hellblade. So he's, been really involved like on the creative side of things. Then you have Nina Christensen and Mike Ball. And Mike Ball has been more or less involved sort of in the tech side of the company, like making sure they have the right equipment, that they're staying on top of motion capture techniques, especially for what they did with Hellblade, which was kind of a leap in a lot of ways there.
Yeah, very well done.
And Nina Christensen is more, like a producer role, like executive kind of role, that sort of thing. But so that's how the three of them sort of, with their roles in the company, but they're each three founders. And so Just Add Monsters was the original company name. So what they had no money, they had no equipment, they had really nothing to start out with other than a company name.
The name.
So they were taking a game idea that they had, and they were pitching it to a lot of different publishers to get funding so that they could get started on something. And nobody bit, on funding the game they wanted to make, but they had offers to buy their company to like purchase them, to acquire them.
Okay.
Which is funny. I don't know why.
And they had not made a product yet.
Not yet.
Point.
They just had a pitch. They just had a game in mind that they wanted to make.
So what that means is people liked the idea but didn't like them. They said, we want your ideas, but we want someone else to make it. We don't think you could make the game.
Well, they still
Otherwise, they'd invest in them.
They still made the game that they pitched. It was just that I don't know. It's like, it's more about like controlling interest in, because, and this is kind of a theme that's going to be going out throughout this. Antoniades in particular really struggled with fighting against big AAA publisher intervention, creative intervention on projects and changing the core of what they were in order to say, no, the market wants this, so you got to make it more this way.
Okay.
And so Hellblade was their first self-published title where they were no longer concerned about how many units they're going to sell or that sort of thing. They were just like, we're going to make this thing the way that we believe it should be made and be very interested in sort of like creative integrity on this project. But like everything they had made before that was interfered with by Sony or Microsoft or Capcom or whoever else. And he talks a lot in interviews about how soul-crushing the AAA machine was as a creator. It was just like impossible to make what he wanted to make doing it the traditional route. And so Hellblade was his answer to that, where he was like, I don't care what the market says. I don't care about any of that. I'm just going to make this game that I feel is important or you know, kind of revolutionary in certain ways. And that was the one finally that sort of broke through, right?
Yeah.
So anyways, they got purchased by a company called Argonaut Games. Now I sort of recognized that name, but I didn't know 5? From where. Well, right. There was a script that we wrote, but I remembered that name from a game I had played before, Argonauts. But I didn't know, I couldn't remember what it was from. Argonaut developed Star Fox and Star Fox 2 and the FX chip for Nintendo.
For the SNES. Wow. Argonaut, huh?
Argonaut Games was the company that it basically developed those titles for Nintendo.
Huh.
Also, the first 2 Harry Potter games on PS1.
Oh, nice. The good ones.
The Philosopher's Stone and Chamber of Secrets.
Chamber of Secrets, yeah.
On PS1.
My wife just played those recently.
Really? The PS1 versions?
Both of those, the PS1.
Yeah.
I think those are the PS1 versions.
So I had played all of those. And anyways, that's where I recognized the name Argonaut Games.
Oh, that's
but
funny.
they were liquidated like shortly after that. So they purchased Just Add Monsters, who eventually became Ninja Theory. And the game that they had wanted to make was called Kung Fu Chaos. It was developed for the Xbox. Not a super well-known game. It's got kind of this really cartoony style. It's sort of like a beat-em-up sort of game. You play like this little kung fu master guy, and you're on platforms, and you're kind of just beating people up and stuff like that. Not really much to write home about. It was not necessarily like a critical or commercial success or anything like that, but it was their first game. And they were sort of starting to work on a sequel to this. But the problem was that Microsoft ended up getting all of the rights to the Kung Fu Chaos intellectual property because Argonaut was liquidated after this. Just Add Monsters had to buy their own company back. It was a huge mess, but they came out of that still alive, but like they didn't like have any money really to like
they still
keep going.
So they still needed slave master
to come in and fund the game they're working on. So they couldn't call it Kung Fu Chaos because like Xbox owned that intellectual property now. So they changed the name to something similar, but then they were kind of looking at trends in the market and they were thinking, I don't think
there was a real trend during this sort of like PS3, Xbox 360 era they were moving into for hyperrealism.
Yes.
So they were like, we should probably try to develop something with more of a realistic look to it. And so that Kung Fu game they were making turned into Heavenly Sword.
Oh, that looks familiar, but I guarantee did not play this game.
Yeah. I mean, not many people did, unfortunately. But this is kind of what it looked like, right? Aesthetically, I guess. Andy Serkis was like the villain in this game. I did play it when it came out, and I liked it. I thought it was pretty cool. So Sony ended up being the ones to back this, and this was another one of those like negotiations where Antoniades came out feeling like his soul was crushed in what he had to end up negotiating or giving up. And the level of like freedom or creativity that they would be able to have with this, right? But there was huge ambitions for this game. So it was almost like a last option. It was like what Sony was offering them was like the last option on the table. They were like, if we could go any other route other than that, we'll take that. But they couldn't make it work. And he described the negotiating process as being a soul-destroyingly difficult process.
Artists, man.
In terms of what he had to, sort of like give up as part of that deal, right?
You just want to be an artist and just be an artist, but you can't. You got
Yes, it's tough. Their ambitions were really sky high for this, though. They wanted to make it into a multimedia franchise.
Oh, really?
They wanted to have like a movie. They wanted to have all kinds of different things. And that's why they were going to Weta Digital and working with Andy Serkis. And it was like there was a lot of plans for this, right? It had really incredible animation quality for the time because of the motion capture technology they were using. But Sony ended up interfering heavily in the creative process. And so a lot of things were changed, a lot of things were cut. The game did not come out like they had hoped it would.
Really?
It was still mostly well received. It was, kind of like an aggregate in the 80s, like low 80s.
Okay.
Score-wise. But it bombed. It just did not sell well at all. And so that...
Weird. With that backing, you'd think it would have...
I know, right?
I don't know. That's interesting.
Yeah. It's because it wasn't marketed well. And the same thing was the problem with the Microsoft deal when they were under Argonaut Games for the Kung Fu Chaos.
They didn't market it.
They just didn't market it well enough. They did not put the money into the marketing. And a lot of times that's really what it takes to succeed. It's how well did you market the thing? Whether it's a bad or a good product. If you market it well enough, it will sell. And so it's just a matter of whether they're willing to put the risk and the money into marketing it, right? And they didn't do a good enough job on that. And so all of those plans for Heavenly Sword, because they were already working on a sequel, they were like already getting the wheel rolling on some other stuff, and Sony just kind of shut it all down. And so as part of the deal that they had made, they lost all of their in-house technologies.
Oh, really?
As part of their contract with Sony for this. So they were back to like square one again.
Oh my gosh. I was going to say, that makes sense. They got all this stuff from Weta, and then that's how they did their motion capture. No?
Nope.
Unbelievable.
They lost a ton of it. And again, he describes it as a heartbreaking moment, right? It was just like another big failure. So from there, they went on to make another, fairly decent-sized game in Enslaved: Odyssey to the West. A lot of people haven't heard of this either.
Nope.
Because it didn't sell that well, but this is kind of what it looked like. I remember seeing copies of this in game stores. And it has like a little bit of like a Horizon feel to it. It's like a technology, but like sort of a sci-fi thing going on. You see like all these like jungle lands, but it's sort of like mixed in with like these robots and things like that that'll like chase you around. Anyways, I remember seeing this game back in the day, but I didn't really have like a ton of interest in playing it. Again, it was kind of like middling reviews, maybe like high 70s, low 80s. And it didn't sell well. But the really interesting thing is that they collaborated on this game with Alex Garland, who is probably not like a name you'll recognize immediately, but you will recognize his work. So he started as a British novelist who wrote The Beach. That was eventually adapted into a film starring Leonardo DiCaprio in 2003.
Oh, really?
But then he went on to write the screenplays for 28 Days Later.
Oh, of course.
Sunshine.
Nice. Oh, nice.
And then
Cillian Murphy movies.
his directorial debut was Ex Machina.
Oh, really?
Which won a ton of Academy Awards.
That was like just a few years ago.
It was like 2014 or 15 or something like that.
Okay.
It's a phenomenal movie.
Well, yeah, and it looks perfect.
Yeah.
The CG looks perfect.
It's a fantastic film. I love that movie. And that was his directorial debut.
Wow.
So he's really good.
Okay,
Alex Garland. So he collaborated with them on this game, Enslaved Odyssey to the West. He wrote it. And again, Antoniadis argued a lot with him. They disagreed on a lot of things. He found him very intimidating to work with, he says. It's not like they had a bad relationship because they did collaborate on other projects later as well. So it's not like, this was a one-off thing.
They didn't burn bridges.
But it was a difficult creative process between the two of them working together. They struggled to get on the same page. And even though the game had a much smaller budget than Heavenly Blade, it still didn't perform well. And so the next game that they made was DMC Devil May Cry, which was a contract from Capcom. So Capcom came to them and said, we'd like you to do a reboot of our Devil May Cry series. Because they really liked the quality of the work they had done on Heavenly Sword, but it was they just hadn't had that commercial success yet, but that wasn't necessarily their fault. It was a lack of marketing, mostly.
So they worked on another company's IP next that already had an audience, right? So it's hey, what can you do with this?
Right, exactly. So Capcom gave them that chance. And it was a highly successful game, but it was also a highly controversial game. It was rated well. I think it was mostly well received by the general gaming audience, but the hardcore Devil May Cry fans were sending death threats to Antoniadis himself.
Well, of course they were.
They were pissed. They did
funny.
Not like the choices made for this game.
Really?
I remember that. I remember, because I've had some exposure to Devil May Cry. I played the original on PS1. I played a little bit of 3. Good friend of mine, Brad Woods, he loved those Devil May Cry games, so he had them all on PlayStation 2. Nice. So I'd go to his house and play them a little bit. I had also played Devil May Cry 4, which I believe 4 came before DMC. And then, I think that's right. If I'm not, I'll correct myself later. But I remember kind of looking into this and being okay, what's going on with this? And Ninja Theory developing this, not Capcom. What's up with that? And anyways, a lot of DMC fans did not like the choices they made, the changes to the character. And Antoniadis did not make it easy on himself.
Well, he's wanted to change the character.
His responses to some of that feedback were the character that you the white-haired, that was cool in 2002 or whatever, but this is cool now. And people were no, it's not, and they freaked out at him, right? So he didn't handle the the PR very well on that, right?
Sure.
So he took a lot of heat for that. But in any case, they started to really diversify their portfolio at this point. It was they were getting into okay, we're going to have some of our employees working on mobile titles and doing some contracted work there, and kind of putting their hands in a lot of different jars at that point. But they had one sort of special unit, one small team that they were we want to publish our own game. So in a sense, it's an indie title, right?
Sure, yeah.
It's not going to have a big budget, but we want this to look like a AAA game. So the production value needs to be here, but the scope of the game is more of something you'd see in the indie.
It's got to be a lot more linear. It's got to be shorter.
Yeah. So that they created a business sort of model around this that they called indie AAA. And that was sort of like their whole concept for
Triple I. Indie.
that was their whole concept for this game. Their original IP, Hellblade, Senua's Sacrifice, that they started working on. And they just had like 15 to 20 people working on this. So a really small team while they were doing all this other stuff, right, at the same time. And a lot of that stuff didn't work out. They were like, yo, man, the mobile space, how competitive this is, and there's like a whole learning curve into how to like go about doing this, and the market's very different. And so they were kind of, again, they were really struggling as a company. They had a lot of good experience, and they'd made some pretty good games up to this point, but they just hadn't had like a real hit.
Yeah.
And Hellblade was the one that like really did it for them, right? So that's kind of the background on the company itself, on Ninja Theory, and like where they were at the time leading up to this. Again, Tamim Antoniades is the writer and director on Hellblade, and what he wanted to do was pretty ambitious, because the project started out as just sort of like, you know, kind of your common hero's tale mixed in with some like Norse mythology.
Okay.
Wanted it to take place like in our world instead of in like some fantasy, you know, world that they just created or something like that. But it wasn't until they got a little bit into the writing process on that he started to think, you know, what if this character had symptoms of mental illness, right? This would work based on like where we're going with this story, for her to be really like struggling with hallucinations and voice hearing and some of these other things. I think that this would strengthen what we're doing with this character, where we're ultimately going with the story. But he learned very quickly how ignorant he was on exactly how to portray a character like that.
Oh, sure.
And like what it's like to live with those symptoms. And
Right.
there's just a whole lot of research that needed to be done. So they ended up, I guess what he says here is, he admits that he didn't have to look very far to discover his own ignorance of the subject. To portray psychosis properly, Ninja Theory consulted with leading neuroscientists and nonprofit organizations like Wellcome Trust to properly capture the experience of psychosis and its devastating effects on the human mind. He learned that people can experience hallucinations and delusional beliefs without it being a problem. The illness comes when those experiences cause suffering. Often the recovery is not about curing yourself of hallucinations, but finding ways to live with them. That was a revelation to me. Up here, you know, he says, it's easy to see the pain and suffering caused by physical disease or physical trauma. It's not so easy to see the mental suffering or trauma or severe mental illness. But what if we could find a way to see it? Games are capable of drawing you in for hours on end, playing the role of a character who's different from you, experiencing their perspective, and actively involving you in a world that functions with a different set of rules. There are many things that happen in the world of Hellblade that make perfect sense within the context of Senua's mind. To complete Senua's quest, you have to internalize and accept the logic and meaning behind these things to progress. So this became an attempt for them to show neurotypical people what it is like to experience some of the symptoms of psychosis. The hallucinations they see, the hyper like pareidolia, the voice hearing, like how do we represent that accurately to somebody who has no concept of what these people actually go through, right? And it became like really important to them that they get that right. So they went to Peter Fletcher and a lot of other people to get help on how do we like portray this properly. They talked to a lot of people who actually do suffer from these symptoms, and they explained it to them, and they would, you know, try to create it in the game and then show it to them. Did we accurately portray this? And they'd say, no, like you should change it like this, or yes, that's exactly like how it is for me. So it was like a lengthy process of consulting in order to like try to really get it right. So, on top of this, they wanted to portray sort of like a time in history that you don't see a lot. So this is like 8th century Celtic culture we're talking about here. And there's not really like a ton known about it in terms of like archaeology and things like that. They've learned more recently, but like this particular group of people, the Picts in the far northern, the Orkney Islands, like way far British islands up here, like at the very, very northern tip. These people were eventually like raided by the Vikings, and it's like unknown what really happened to them. Whether the Vikings completely wiped them out, or whether they sort of just assimilated them, right? They just kind of became one
I can tell you what probably happened.
Based on the reputation of the Vikings.
Yeah, well, they killed the men and then brought the women back. So it's like a little of both.
Yes.
The women of the Picts would have survived.
Yes.
And born Viking sons and daughters, whereas the men Picts were slaughtered.
Right.
That's likely what happened, yeah.
Well, and then, the Vikings did a lot of sacrifice, a human sacrifice to the gods. They were very, very brutal warrior people. Yeah. And so this was kind of like the setting he had decided on, right? Was to have a Pict warrior.
Suffering from a Norse invasion.
Yes.
Kind of picking up the pieces of their life.
Who also suffers from severe mental illness and psychosis, which is a really unique thing. Like, you've never seen this before.
No, I haven't.
I haven't in anything, but particularly in video games.
Right,
Nothing like this had ever been done, so it's really cool. But like some background and history on the Picts, they had actually avoided the Roman Empire for a long time. Like the Romans tried to conquer them.
The Romans had like the South and like England.
Yeah.
But they didn't have as much of
They couldn't conquer them.
Yeah.
Like they were a really, they would have been described by the Romans as savages.
Oh, of course,
And what's the word I'm looking for? Barbarians.
Barbarians,
right?
Yep.
But they built a wall. They like built a wall like across, like way in the north. What's the area called? I think I wrote it down.
Is it near Scotland?
Yeah. So Hadrian's Wall is what it's called. And it's still there. I mean, you can still like see it today, right? And this was built by the Romans to like, so it's like right here. I can pull this up on the map.
So not quite to Scotland, but close.
Hadrian's Wall. And they were just like, you people stay the fetch away from us. Yeah. Because they could not conquer them. They were like really, really like fierce warriors, the Picts. And so they were able to avoid assimilation into the Roman Empire until the Vikings showed up.
Yes.
And this was in the late 8th century. So, quote here from Antoniadis, the original idea for Hellblade was to create a classic hero's journey, a journey of suffering, but one where the fantasy world is not another planet or alternate universe, but a world that is constructed in Senua's mind. But to do so would mean putting psychotic mental illness at the center stage of the experience, a subject that is still considered taboo, and a challenge that is both terrifying and exciting in equal measure. I came to learn that the Celts had a sophisticated and nuanced perspective on the nature of mental disorder. One term they used was gelt. A gelt is a man or woman who had been driven mad by a curse, battle trauma, or grief. The gelt would take to a life in the woods in search of penance, punishment, and purgation. And so Senua became a gelt, cursed by darkness, looking for redemption in the wilds. So that's what they would do when someone would exhibit maybe similar symptoms to what Senua had. It's like, this person's cursed. They have to go purge that curse by living alone in the wilderness and finding like penance from the gods or something like that, right?
Yes.
So that served as a big influence for like how the story developed for Senua here. Another word the Celts used in reference to mental disorders was druth, meaning fool or liar, one who utters the words of God. They tell of the mad sinner who flees battle into exile and takes on a beastly nature, growing feathers on his body. The character called Druth in Hellblade is based on a little-known person called Findan, an 8th century Irish Celt who was captured and enslaved by the Vikings, but eventually escaped to Orkney, where he became a monk. So Druth is a character, is like a mentor character throughout the game for Senua.
And there's a specific story with Druth where with Findel?
Findan, his character,
where Findan has to escape through fire, a trial, and is reborn as Druth after the trial, and Senua kind of has to recreate that herself.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah.
So, let's see. He says here, so the stage was set for a new adventure, a journey into the Norse underworld called Hell. A vision quest fueled by madness and myth, a fantasy that was created by Senua's mind, and one that we would experience through her eyes. So that was kind of like the concept. They sort of like resolved on that concept. There has been some criticism of Hellblade and its representation of mental illness. I don't want to get into that in the first episode. I want to like actually get through the game so that everyone has played it and like knows the whole story before we go into that. But I do want people to know that that is like something I really want to dive into and give a very fair look to. Because there are some good points that have been raised by people who suffer from some of these symptoms, and when they played Hellblade, they did not feel that their experience was accurately represented, in spite of all that they did to try their very best. I mean, consulting with people who had those symptoms, who lived with those symptoms, and with professionals who work with those people and scientists who study this, right? They really, really tried, and they were very well intentioned in trying their best to be accurate and to validate people's experiences. But there are some people who feel they failed at that, and I do want to like give that its fair due. But I want to bring that up in episode 2 at the end, after we've actually played through the whole game. So I just want you to know we are going to cover that, but just not today. He goes on to say here, to make a game about a warrior with psychotic mental illness as its central theme was fraught with danger, for the reasons we just explained. Mental illness, such as psychosis, is still taboo and rarely acknowledged in a century of cinema, never mind the new medium of games. Where it does feature, it often conflates psychosis and psychopathy, which is associated with a lack of empathy. It's unfortunate that these two words sound so similar, that they are used interchangeably in media, because they are not the same thing, right, at all. I must admit that I didn't have to look very far to discover my own ignorance on the subject, right? So he reached out to Paul Fletcher, psychiatrist and professor of health and neuroscience at the University of Cambridge. And this is what Paul Fletcher describes psychosis as. Psychosis is a descriptive term, and it refers to having a loss of contact with objective reality. It's characterized by two main sets of symptoms. One of them is hallucinations, where somebody experiences perceptions when there is no actual objective thing out there to perceive. And the other is delusions, where somebody comes to often very bizarre, unpleasant, frightening beliefs when there's no good evidence in favor of them. So that's a pretty good summary of what the symptoms of psychosis are all about. It is losing touch with objective reality. And because of those things, you develop these beliefs or delusions without really having good evidence for them. So we're going to talk about the ways in which Senua like exhibits those two parts of it, the delusions and then the breaks with objective reality as we get into the game proper. Wellcome is a biomedical research charity, right? They spend billions of dollars on research and awareness programs that are aimed on improving mental health. This is one of the organizations they reached out to. We have, it's a hard name to pronounce. I think it's Ian Dodgen? Ian, maybe? It's just spelled kind of funny.
Yeah, that's how Ian McGilchrist spells his name too, actually.
Ian? Okay, so Ian Dodgen, I think.
Yeah.
Who said, mental health hasn't always been presented in the media in a way that is particularly helpful. It can be challenging to engage people with the subject matter, and there are a lot of preconceived ideas about mental health, and particularly schizophrenia and psychosis. So we hope our support allows the team to continue to collaborate with Paul Fletcher and with those who have experience of psychosis to create the game that provides a fresh perspective on the condition and allows audiences to engage with it in a way that just wouldn't be possible in any other medium. So the people who were involved in this, that was really a big goal for them. They wanted to represent it accurately. They knew that media does not typically portray this in a way that is helpful. They often, like Antoniadis was saying, they conflate psychopathy, so they'll just show these people clawing at walls or being these villainous, like, people who have total lack of empathy. And that's not what people with psychosis are going through. These people are perfectly capable of empathy. They just see things and hear things, and it makes it tough for them to understand what's real and what's not.
Yes.
And it can create delusions, and it's a really horrifying thing for many of these people to live through. He describes some of the things that these people suffer through. Anyways, he was talking about how there was a girl that they had talked to who 24/7, there's a person screaming at her all day long and banging on her door and walls. This person lives with that constantly. A woman just screaming at her all the time. I mean, just imagine for a moment, like, what that would be like to live your entire life with that voice.
Right, yeah.
Always, 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 always around you. They described another woman who saw corpses, would see corpses hanging all the time. And they were so vivid and so real that you would rush and try to, like, help them down. Like, try to, like, cut them down and stuff.
Yeah.
Like, it's just, the game, I think what the game was setting out to do was raise awareness to this fact and create empathy for this type of life experience with neurotypical people who don't have any idea what this is like, and who maybe see the word psychosis and conflate it with psychopathy and think it's something totally different than what it really is, right? That's what creates the taboo and the stigma, and that stigma is what makes life so hard for these people. It's not so much the symptoms themselves, which they've lived with their whole lives, and it's like they understand that, they live with that, it's part of every day for them, but it's the way they're treated, it's the way they're seen, it's the way that their lives are stigmatized that causes, like, the real harm.
Right.
And I think what this game was setting out to do was to, like, inform people a little bit more about that, give them a character they could relate to, put them in that lived experience a little bit, and try to destigmatize that. So I think that that's really noble as, like, a goal.
Sure, yeah.
Whether or not they were wholly successful, I mean, I don't think it was ever going to be possible for them to perfectly accomplish that.
No, of course not. But I have some things to say about that. I'll probably go towards the criticism end, so we can talk about that later.
Okay.
But Carl Jung was very interested in these types of people with psychosis specifically.
Yeah.
Because they lived their life in a lucid, dreamlike state, like all the time. And they had access to a part of their subconscious that nobody else does. So he would gain a lot of insight into how the brain works from people who had different forms of psychosis.
Right.
So, yeah, that's cool.
So they also collaborated with Professor Charles Fernyhough, who is a leading expert in voice hearing in particular. He's at Durham University. And this was really interesting because I have an experience that I have not shared with a lot of people. I've shared it once on my Discord recently, but it's because I was sort of like looking into this game. I don't know if I've told you this story, so this will be interesting to talk about.
We'll see.
But what he says here is hearing voices is an experience that is usually associated with severe mental illness. Crucially, we know that hearing voices is a part of ordinary life for many people who don't meet the criteria for mental illness.
Sure.
We know voices vary according to where they appear in space. Voices can appear far away, in the distance, they can appear right there in your ear. They can seem to be coming from inside your head. So this is where they decided to record the voice hearing that Senua hears in the game using a binaural microphone.
Yeah.
Which is like set up with like two mics at about the same width as your ears on your head. And the idea is that the actors would then move around the mics, and it would give you a sense that these voices are moving around you in space. So they're coming really close and then like going away and then getting right up into your ear, and they're all up in your space, and then they're moving around you, like a really disorienting sense, which is why they recommend that you play the game with headphones right at the beginning. They're like, play the game with headphones because you won't have the same experience otherwise. It like requires that. So if you're going to play the game, make sure that you play it with headphones. But so I came across that quote, right? Crucially, we know that hearing voices is a part of ordinary life for many people who don't meet the criteria for mental illness. So when I was 18, I had an experience where I woke up in the middle of the night. It was one of those things where you wake up and you're like, oh no, is it like time to wake up and go to work? I'm still tired. I hope it's not like 7 o'clock yet. So I was turning toward the clock and it was like 2 a.m. I was like, yes, I get to go back to sleep kind of a thing, right? So I was conscious. This was not like a half dream state or anything like that. I was fully aware. I was fully awake. This was not anything like, because I have had like sleep paralysis. And I've seen the sleep paralysis demon people talk about. I've seen that a lot. And that was more like in my early 20s. I experienced that pretty frequently. I haven't so much in recent times. It's sort of like stopped happening to me as I got into my 30s. But I would have sleep paralysis almost like once a month from maybe age like 22 to 25, somewhere in that range. It was like all the time. And it's like a horrifying thing, dude. It's like you cannot move. I experienced not only being able to not move, but not being able to breathe. So for like 30 seconds, 45 seconds, a minute.
I had that when I was younger, elementary school aged or something. I could never explain it. It's like you forget how to breathe. Like technically you know what to do to breathe, but you open your mouth or you'll try to breathe and it just won't happen. And then after a while, all of a sudden it just hits and you can breathe. And you're like, it's crazy.
It's so
that happened
scary.
to me a lot. That hasn't happened to me in 20 years probably.
It's so scary because you cannot control your body at all. You are completely paralyzed. Your mouth, your hands, your lungs, like everything is paralyzed. So you can't call out for help. You can't be like, oh,
you can't talk, breathe. You can't do anything.
Nothing. You're just laying there completely helpless.
And part of that is because your brain separates from your body when you sleep.
The deep sleep cycle.
And your brain literally, it just disconnects and you can't do anything. It has to reconnect, and sometimes you'll wake up before it's done that. And that's freaky.
In a healthy sleep cycle, you'll go from light sleep to REM sleep to deep sleep, and then you go back out again several times through the night. You kind of go in and out of it, in and out of it.
When
you're in that deep sleep, everybody experiences this, they just don't know it. You are paralyzed in deep sleep.
You can't move.
Your brain has like disconnected from the body. You're not moving. You're paralyzed in that state.
And you can't move.
So when you experience sleep paralysis consciously, your brain woke up, but it did not come out of that paralysis yet. And so you're just, what's going on? What's going on? What's going on? You're thinking this, right? Like, holy crap, I can't move. What's happening? In my experience, I had a couple times where I couldn't breathe too. It wasn't always that way. Sometimes I could breathe fine, but I couldn't speak. I couldn't move. This is a big tangent on sleep paralysis, but the point is, your brain can do some really, really messed up stuff to you.
Of course,
And it can become really easy, particularly we live in a more secular society today that understands a lot more about how the brain works. So like you can get on Google and find out like, what was this happened to me? What happened here? And you can learn about what happened to you, right? Now imagine an 8th century picked person experiencing something like that. How would they explain that, right? So anyways, my experience with the voice hearing that I had, I turned back away from the clock and I all of a sudden went paralyzed. I couldn't move. I was still awake.
That's different, huh?
And all of a sudden, I was just frozen. And then I physically felt a sensation moving up my spine like a snake or an eel, like slithering around my spine. And I was like, what is happening? What is happening? What is happening?
Yeah.
It started to bore into my skull. And it got in, and it was swimming around in my head. And I was like, what the freak is happening?
Yeah, that's a live dream. That's very interesting.
And then I heard a voice, but not from inside my head, from outside. The sensation was from outside, as if the person was standing next to my ear, speaking to me, saying all of these weird, creepy, prophetic things to me. And it lasted maybe about a minute or so, and then it all kind of stopped. And even I, a person in the modern age, was like, I just got spoken to by a demon.
Sure.
What the freak is happening?
Yes.
I ran upstairs and oh my gosh, I just had contact with a freaking demon.
Well, and in many ways you really did. But here's an interesting thing. In India, in Hindu, what would you call it? Like religion, there's the idea of a snake that wraps itself around your spinal column.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and comes up into your mind.
So other people have had that experience before.
What you just described is literally written down in Hindu scripture.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a thing.
And
depending on how you define demon.
Whether this is collective unconscious, or whether this is just something that your brain will do to you. It's just your brain can malfunction sometimes and do weird stuff to you. And this is something that's happened to a lot of people, obviously, it seems, in India. But that happened to me once in my life. And it was a life-changing experience. At least it felt that way at the time.
Right.
I was like, what is happening? I felt like I was going to be visited again, or this was going to happen more often. And how am I going to deal with this kind of a thing?
But it didn't.
No, never again.
Not like that. Okay.
Even though the voice told me it would come again, it never ended up coming again. So, and it gave me a specific date and everything, and that didn't happen.
Oh,
so,
I see.
Anyways, I had that experience one time, a single minute-long experience, right? And it was just totally shook me. Now imagine there are people who live with that every day of their lives.
Right. So you're afraid to sleep, so then you become sleep deprived, then you start hallucinating during the daytime. It just builds.
And after reading that and thinking about that, all of a sudden I just had all of this empathy for people who experience things of that kind every single day of their lives.
So my wife, for years and years and years, she worked professionally as a therapist with people with who to the point where they cannot function well in society have severe mental illness.
Yeah.
And I have some stories throughout the game of some similarities I've noticed. I can't, I'm not going to say anybody's name or anything, but,
Sure.
But a lot of this is quite familiar to what she would describe, especially finding symbolism and meaning in things that maybe aren't really there, and seeing things from. Anyways, it's this game definitely but it's a specific type of psychosis. So I feel like certain people who didn't have quite this experience may be critical in saying this isn't what it's like. But it's well, it'd probably be different, a little different for everybody, right? Yeah. And so this would be an example of a specific type. In a specific situation, as opposed to something that anyone with any kind of mental illness can look at and say that this represents them,
Exactly. So this is the type of thing that they were trying to represent. They didn't want to go too far with it. They didn't want to misrepresent it. They didn't want to, be insensitive about it. And
it's a delicate thing.
Very delicate thing
they're walking
dealing with.
A thin line.
A big risk that they took.
Yeah.
And they really put the work in. They really tried their hardest to do it right. Quote here, "It's very hard to represent what this experience is like, partly because it's such a personal, intense, emotional experience. It's a testament to how Ninja Theory have been listening to what the researchers are saying, but also crucially listening to the experts by experience. What they've come up with is so compelling. It's by far the best representation I've heard of what these experiences are like. So I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. We've mostly got kind of the important bits of like what they were, trying to do with this game, right? Like what the goals were, how much work they put into it. Yeah. There's a whole like about 30-minute documentary that they made. It's actually in the bonus features of Senua's Sacrifice. So if you have the game, you can just go watch this little video. And a lot of these quotes I've copied down are directly from that.
Okay,
it's like a really, really in-depth sort of behind-the-scenes like making of little feature. And so I definitely recommend people go check that out to like kind of get the full story behind it. There are some things that we'll be returning to when we talk about the criticism portion of this in the second episode I was talking about.
Yes.
I have some quotes here in red that I think address some of the things that were brought up, either in ways that I think are defensible or in other ways that are like, yeah, I see the point here, but this might not have been handled perfectly.
Yeah.
So we'll go over those then.
Perfect.
But the other thing I wanted to talk about, so we have the hallucinations, the voice hearing, but pareidolia is like another big thing, because it's basically how all the puzzles in this game, because there's a lot of puzzles in the game, it's basically all based around this idea of pareidolia. So pareidolia is something like basically everybody does, but there are some, particularly those who suffer with some of these symptoms, that have like this really heightened sense of it. And I think this is what you were just describing.
Seeing symbols.
Yes.
Yeah.
Seeing. So like if you're looking at the clouds, right, and you see faces in the clouds, you see like a dinosaur, you're seeing these shapes and you're like attributing meaning to them.
Yes.
That's more or less like the idea of pareidolia, right? So pareidolia is the tendency for perception to impose a meaningful interpretation on a nebulous stimulus, usually visual, so that one sees an object, pattern, or meaning where there is none. Common examples are perceived images of animals, faces, or objects in cloud formations, seeing faces in inanimate objects, or lunar pareidolia, like the man in the moon or the moon rabbit. The concept of pareidolia may extend to include hidden messages in recorded music, played in reverse or at a higher or lower than normal speed.
Depending on how sensitive you are to that stuff, you will notice things.
Yeah. And hearing voices, mainly indistinct, or music in random noise, such as that produced by air conditioners or fans. So this is the idea behind pareidolia, right? That's the concept of it. And some of these people who suffer with these symptoms have a really heightened sense for this. So they're always seeing a pattern or a meaning in something. And even people who are not suffering with psychosis, I do know some people who do have like a really heightened sense for this. So Christine, she's always seeing things like this. Oh, do you see the face in the? And I'm like, huh? Like I'm squinting, like I'm really trying to like look at it. Yeah, it's right there. Like these are the eyes, and this is the mouth, and this is the jaw. And
I've always been
like,
bad at
okay,
those.
like I guess I see what you're looking at.
Do you remember those books, or I think they used to put them in maybe magazines back in the day, where it was just a static image, but if you go cross-eyed, you'll see a 3D, you'll see something.
Yeah.
I could never do those.
Oh, really?
In part because of I have an issue with one of my eyes where I actually don't see well out of my left eye. So going cross-eyed was like, no, it didn't. I still saw normally anyways. It was very strange. So those never worked, but I feel like it's similar to that. Where you've got the static image, but if you look at it just right, you can see this like glorious picture. Yeah, like painting.
I wonder what happened to those, because I
was big for like 3 years.
I really liked that because I could do it.
I couldn't.
It was kind of cool. And actually, now that I think about it, that's really similar to some of the puzzles in this game, where it's like there's pieces of an image of like a flight of stairs, but you have to look at it from just the right angle to bring it into view. But like at any other angle, it just looks like weird fractals and like broken mirror, almost like sort of images that are like scattered around in the environment. It's like, whoa, what's happening there, right? But if you look at it just right, it's like, oh, there's a picture that comes together.
Yeah.
So anyways, that's pareidolia. That's like another big thing.
Well, do you know what that is, though, when you're doing that? You are taking the 3D and you're making it 2D. basically. You're bringing something from a higher dimension down into a more simple dimension. So once you see everything from a certain perspective, and it's like, oh, there it is. It's all 3D up until that point, and then you flatten it out. And you make it a 2D thing.
Yeah.
It's interesting. It's a literal practice of bringing a third dimension thing into your mind, at least, making it 2D. And then you can comprehend it better. And then you can go do what you need to do.
Right.
Yeah, it's cool stuff.
There's a line from the game that I took down that illustrates this tendency for Senua. I think it's just the narrator who's sort of that woman voice that you hear, one of the voices, but the one who's like the predominant one.
Yeah.
She says, when she was younger, she would lay in the grass and stare at the clouds. And there she saw them, elusive, shifting faces. After a while, she could see the faces everywhere, in the trees, in the mountains, the caves. I wonder, can you see the faces too? They're there if you look for them. Mm-hmm. And this is where she sees her mother. She's always seeing her in a waterfall or in the side of a cliff face or something like that. She's seeing her mother's face, and she speaks to her mother as you're going throughout the game, and she's seeing them in these patterns in caves
just
and
in
mountains and in nature, right?
Yep.
So that I thought was a really interesting line that sort of illustrates this idea of pareidolia.
It's also the mother goddess that's hidden in the chaos of nature.
Yeah, Paul Fletcher described this as people begin to see patterns in the world. They begin to link things that most people wouldn't link. Most of these things we might think would be coincidence or not worth commenting on. Nevertheless, that might have a particular salience or importance to them. One individual described how everyday words, sounds, colors, and objects were steeped in meaning to him, forming a strange and sinister puzzle that he was determined to solve but could not quite get to the bottom of. I mean, this person just every day seeing meaning in things that we would all just take for granted, right? And this is, someone put this here
and saying
for
you
a
can't
reason.
quite get to the bottom of it.
I've got to solve it. There's something here that someone's trying to tell me, right? So, this person's dealing with that every day, thinking I got to solve this problem. Like someone's trying to tell me something.
The hardest part about that is that, at least the way it's described here and elsewhere, as I'm going to mention, is that you feel like you're on the edge of discovering it.
Yes.
You're about to discover it.
Yes.
So it's not just that it's there, but that you're, oh my gosh, you're one clue.
I'm so
you're
close.
right there, and you're going to crack the code.
Yeah.
This happens to people with, well, maybe not all, hashtag not all, people with epilepsy.
Yeah.
I have heard epilepsy described when people can sense that an epileptic seizure is oncoming, is about to hit, their mind starts to open in the strangest way, and they start to kind of see things in a different perspective. And it's almost as if, so the way this was described was that they're on the verge of the most important discovery of mankind, and that things are finally making sense to them. And then everything goes black, and then they wake up, and then they can't get there again.
How?
But you're on the verge.
How frustrating a life
yes
would that be?
That's
just constantly.
And you're always on the edge. You're like, I'm this close, and that's why you can't give it up, because it's like you're just this close. You can't stop. Not even if they wanted to, they probably couldn't. But I'm just saying that makes it so much worse when you feel like you're right there on the cusp.
Yeah, Paul Fletcher goes on to say it's not brain dysfunction. It's not like the system shut down. It's actually an incredibly creative process.
Yes, this is why Carl Jung studied these people so heavily, because they're like, this is the creative processes of the brain being manifest at its most extreme.
Yeah.
And that's what interested Carl Jung more than anything else. So he dealt with these types of patients.
The person creates a world populated with voices and phantoms and terrors, and they're completely immersed in it. They believe in it. So it's not like the brain's malfunctioning. It's like hyper-functioning.
Yes.
In this way, right?
In that way, yeah.
Which is a really interesting way of thinking about it.
Oh, very much so.
Antoniadis went on to say that some of these people that they were sort of consulting with who were living with the symptoms, when they were playing the game, they said that they didn't see much evidence of mental illness in the game.
Oh, in the game?
Yeah. They were like, I don't really see...
This is normal.
And he was people with delusions of all sorts would argue the same thing, that they are not aware of their experience being abnormal in any way.
Well, and that's what makes this so difficult.
Yes.
The game, what they tried to accomplish with this game is so hard, especially if you're going to use people who have those types of issues, the way somebody with a psychosis will describe themselves to someone else is not the way that you would describe it were you to experience what they experience, right? Because it's a version of reality to them, which is true to some point for everybody. We're all kind of projecting things onto things, and everything we see is a pattern, not the objective actual thing, generally speaking. But it's just they're projecting more onto it than most people do, and they're over projecting. And we only say over projecting because it's abnormal, but that's essentially what's going on there. But they wouldn't describe to you objectively what they're going through, because it's difficult for them to see objectively what they're going through and to sort what's real and what's not. So they'll say, oh, it's not a big deal, or it doesn't bother me too much, or maybe it does, but I'm always seeing this thing, where in reality they're seeing many other things that are also there, but that they just aren't.
They think that they don't see it as an issue at all.
Exactly. And so you can't talk to them. You also can't talk to the psychiatrists. You can talk to them. Please talk to them. But you can't just figure everything out from talking to them. You can't figure everything out from talking to the psychiatrist or psychologist. You can't figure it all out from talking to the scientists, neuroscience, anybody, any of that. None of them can give you the full picture, because those who experience it have too difficult a time conveying it to people who don't experience it, and then the people who are studying it are typically those people who don't experience it. So you're in no man's land, but I commend people who make an effort to try to understand this, which is what art is essentially. It's taking something you don't understand super well and kind of making it into like a metaphor of sorts that is more understandable to more people. And you're gonna leave things out, you're gonna get things wrong, but I think it's commendable that you even tried to do that in the first place. I think that's a good use of art.
Another interesting thing just about the development of the game, to kind of wrap this up, is Melina Jurgens is the actress who portrays Senua. She was actually just the team's...
That's a Scandinavian name, by the way. Jurgen.
She was just the team's video editor. She was not like an actress or anything like this before this time.
Oh, wait, no, I heard about this. She was the editor, and they had her stand in.
Yes. She was just standing in so they could get, kind of perfect their motion capture. They were kind of like, testing it out. And she did such a good job portraying the character in these stand-ins that she didn't realize she's being auditioned the whole time.
Did you know?
Go ahead.
Maybe I shouldn't bring this up, but did you know John Heder was not supposed to be Napoleon Dynamite?
I remember hearing that.
He wasn't. He was in the pretend, what do you call it? The 10-minute Peluca, the short film that was made by Jared Hess, and then he just kind of was. They were going to cast someone else. Fox Searchlight was going to cast someone else, not him. He just happened to be in the little short film. They ended up picking him because he was so perfect. But it was not supposed to be him. They had a bunch of famous actors they were going to use.
It's kind of
that kind of thing happens. It's like lightning in the bottle moment.
It's just like they realize, we've got exactly what we need right here.
And it's not only that she was there at the right place at the right time. I'm sure that happens to a lot of people who don't notice it. It's that she also then chose to really reveal her talents then and there, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So they could have had her stand in, and she stood there and decided not to take it too seriously, and then the role everything would have passed right by her, But she decided to take it very seriously, and that's what led to this. So that's crazy.
Just like the exact right moment. But she won all kinds of awards.
Yeah, she did.
Because her performance is
very good,
amazing in this game.
Yeah,
it's incredible. So anyways, I'll get back to a lot of this. Is a lot of the red text I was talking about that addresses some of those criticisms later.
Oh, that you'll come to later.
So we'll come back to these. But that more or less kind of wraps up like the thought process. Again, I really encourage people to go watch that sort of behind the scenes feature. There's a lot more info in there, and it's really, really good. A really good behind the scenes look of what they were trying to do. So let's jump into the game itself. So it starts off with Senua kind of like rafting down a river in a little canoe, like a hollowed out, just tree trunk canoe.
Yeah.
And we're sort of introduced to her by one of the voices that she hears, right?
Yes.
Like one of the personas, I guess. I think they're called Furies. That's like the term that the picked people are using for these voices. So one of these furies that she hears is like introducing us. We're like one of the new voices or presences that sort of like follow her around. And that's kind of like what the camera is like our first person look or view as we follow her around like these furies do.
Yeah.
And so one of the furies
show off and look at us.
Yeah, like directly in the camera
Yes.
as if we're like there with her.
And in many ways we are. We are one of the furies who our presence is governing her fate.
Yes.
That's how all video games are. But
Yeah.
in this particular one, it's very interesting. It's
So
very important.
this sort of like predominant fury among the many voices is like taking us under her wing and sort of introducing us and like welcoming us as one of like the new
One of the new
people
personalities of the
following
in
her
her
around
head. Yeah.
and sort of like getting us caught up, which I thought was pretty clever as a way of like, because it doesn't start from like the beginning of the story. The story is delivered in a very non-linear way. So it kind of jumps around a lot into like different flashbacks or like narrated sequences to describe what happened to her before she got here. We're coming like kind of right into the middle of things. So Senua has, at the beginning of the game, basically what we know is she has suffered some kind of tragedy. And she has come seeking Helheim, which is like the Viking hell, right? To address whatever happened. That's basically all we know.
Yeah.
And so this voice will fill in a lot of the story. Then there's Druth, who was like a mentor of hers that she knew while she was in the wilds. That will fill in a lot of the story when he talks to her, when she hears his voice.
Yeah.
Then there's also legitimate flashbacks that you see that fill in a lot of that stuff. So there's all these different ways that they're going about filling in the holes of what happened leading up to how we got here.
Yeah.
And that's not told in any kind of linear way. It sort of jumps around a lot. So on a first playthrough, it can get easy to become a little lost as to like what the like thread of the story actually is.
That was true for me. Yeah.
So upon a second playthrough, it gets easier to sort of like, piece it together.
Yeah.
But let's just kind of reveal it as the game reveals it rather than starting from the beginning to end. So anyways, I like this dialogue though when she's welcoming you, hello, who are you? Oh, it doesn't matter. Welcome. You're safe with me. I'll be right here. Nice and close so we can speak without alerting others. So it's like we're being secretive. She almost like she doesn't want Senua to hear that we're talking about her kind of a thing, right? Let me tell you about Senua. Her story has already come to an end, but now it begins anew. So you hear these voices, though, saying, it's breathing. The head is breathing. She's getting closer. Dillian. So we don't know who Dillian is.
Right.
We don't really know what they're talking about, but she is carrying on like a pouch on her back a skull. Yeah. It's like a wrapped up skull, and she's got it like on her belt, hanging from her belt.
Yeah.
So these voices are kind of flying around. It's breathing. The head is breathing. Like it's really disorienting. My first time playing the game, I don't know if you played with headphones or not, but
I did.
Okay. The first time I was playing it, this effect was like so well done that one of the voices kind of flew past my right ear. I was actually recording this. I like had a face cam on, and I turned my head this way, thinking somebody was in the room trying to talk to me. And I like took off my headphones, and I was like, "Wait, oh my gosh, they got me, dude!" Like,
well, and they will continue to get you. Throughout the whole game.
So it's really well done in the fact that even though I knew I'm playing a game, even though I knew they're trying to create this effective voice hearing, it sounded like it was coming from my actual room, the space I was in. So they did such a good job with that. So she said, this is a journey deep into darkness. There will be no more stories after this one. Which is kind of ironic because there's a Hellblade 2 coming out soon.
yes, of course.
We'll talk about that too, my feelings on that. But.
Gotta make that money.
So she said, how rude of me. I never told you of the others. You hear them too, right? So you're hearing all these voices.
Yep.
They've been around ever since the tragedy. So they just refer to this tragedy that happened. That sort of like changed everything for Senua. This was like a huge, life-changing event a terrible tragedy that happened to her, and that's why she has come seeking Helheim, what the Northmen call hell, right? Hel. Look around you and you'll see them, the drowned, the sick, the slain. Here they lie, rotting in the fields and rivers of hell. But the dead don't always lie still here. This is not a place of rest. What is she thinking? Anyway, she gets to the point where she kind of comes up to the shore, and this voice is saying, "Oh, she heard us. There's no going back. I wonder, or there might still be time to get back in the boat and leave if you want to." And so she kicks the boat away.
Yeah.
Like there's no possibility of turning back. I'm fully committed to this journey that she's on, right? So why don't you join us? The voice says to us, maybe you too have a part to play in this story. And that's how it gets started. So you're kind of coming up to, it's actually this image that you see on the back here. There's a big like building or structure that kind of looks like it has almost like a beak, almost like a bird-like looking head or something like that.
Almost like a raven.
Almost like a raven, although it's not Valravn's, because this bridge.
You know, it kind of looks like a horse.
Yeah, a little bit,
It
like
looks like
a
horse,
Trojan horse or something.
Just it's missing a part.
Yeah. Anyway, so she sees this. She's on this beach, and this bridge is what leads into Helheim, right?
Yeah.
And so she's got to get onto that bridge and cross it, but it mentions that only the dead can cross that bridge, right? Mm-hmm. So like she's gonna have to figure out a way, being alive, to like get across that bridge and get in there. So that's kind of the first indicator they give you of like a goal. Like we got to get across this bridge. And I connected this a little bit because the documentary kind of does too, with the part about the delusions, like coming to a conclusion about something even though you don't have like good evidence for it, right? And there's like believing so much in that being a part of like a symptom of psychosis. The voice says, there's no doubt about it, the source of darkness is in Helheim, and the goddess Hela holds his soul there.
Right.
So she's there to go retrieve the soul of somebody named Dillian, right, who was her beloved. This is actually the skull of the person that she's carrying on her back. So she's going into hell to save her beloved. And she believes like she can go into hell and like retrieve his soul. Yeah. She's like fully believing that this is possible. Right?
Not only that, but the way to do it and how she's going about it.
Yeah.
She has some idea that this will work.
Right. Okay. Oh, I also thought it was kind of cool. It was kind of a clever line that the narrator is saying that she forgot the name of the bridge, but she doesn't forget that only the dead can cross it. So like the function of it is like you have to be dead to get across this thing. I don't remember what it's called, but I definitely remember like what you need to do to get over it. You have to die, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so then
and that's an aspect of the human mind where we know the use of things,
yes,
or we will often project onto a thing the use of the thing, without knowing exactly what the thing is or what it's called.
Right.
But we know what it's there for, and that's part of seeing the world symbolically, more or less.
Yeah.
You know what things mean, but you don't really know what they are. But you know what they mean because they're speaking to you. You know.
Right. Okay, so then we get introduced to Druth, because there's all these runes that are kind of scattered throughout the world, and you go sort of examine those runes, and then Druth will talk to you, and he usually gives you some Norse mythology.
Yes.
It's like stories that he told her. He's not telling her now, she's remembering what he told her when she met him. So I'm just going to kind of like talk about this now, because I can't remember exactly when they say this, but anyways, they reveal this at some point a little later. But Druth was someone that she met while she was as a Gelt, that term we learned earlier, right? She was sort of like, she went out into the woods to like, kind of like purge this curse from her, right? She suffers all these symptoms. She doesn't understand them. Everyone sees them as a curse, like she's a cursed person. So she went out into the wilds to like purge herself of this curse. And she met him, Druth, out in the wilderness. And he sort of helped her survive and was a companion to her and a mentor to her for a little while before he died of his severe burns and wounds that he had suffered in his escape from the Vikings as a slave.
Yeah.
So he told her a bunch of stories about the Northmen, about the Vikings and their religious practices and their mythology and their beliefs.
Yep.
So all of these...
she as a Pict was not part of the Viking tradition, the Viking religion.
Right.
The Picts may have had some similarities, but they were not Norse Scandinavian by religion.
Yes.
So they didn't have the Thor and Odin and all that stuff.
Yeah.
So
actually, that's a good thing. I forgot.
I
to bring
didn't
this
know
up.
that when I started playing the game.
Yeah.
I was like, oh, she's part of the Scandinavian. She's one of them. This is just she's making contact with the gods of her culture,
Yes,
right?
but
that's actually not the case.
Right.
Yes.
She's going to the Northmen's gods.
Yes, which explains a lot. And it also, maybe we'll get into later exactly why she's doing this, but it's important to understand that these are not her gods.
Yes. Yes, they're not. And I'm glad that you brought that up, that the Picts were a separate thing. They had their own gods and own mythology. Because the inspiration for the name Senua came from a pretty recent discovery of a Pict goddess named Senuna.
Oh.
But originally they thought the name was Senua, and Antonianus liked that name, so he just, that kind of is what stuck. But the actual name of the Pict goddess that they discovered in their archaeological digs was Senuna.
Senuna.
So they had a goddess named Senuna, the Picts did, and so that's where the name Senua comes from.
Cool.
Okay, so yeah, you'll see these runes scattered all throughout the world. You go examine them, and Druth will give you a little lesson or a little story about the Norse gods. So I want to talk about this a little bit, and we'll probably reiterate or go over this in a little more detail when we get into the criticism thing again in the next episode. But one thing that I think I've seen a couple people bring up, I think you even mentioned this, like, what does this have to do with the story? All these Norse myths, we're taking these breaks to have Druth explain these Viking
just
stories,
general stories about Ymir
and it's
Odin. And
what is this? How is this related to what's going on? How is this adding to the game? So,
and especially early on, it just isn't that clear that those were things I needed to pay attention to at all. It just seems like general history lessons and such.
In the broader sense, I don't think you need to necessarily know the details of these myths in order to understand the story. But I was recently studying Beowulf a little bit, just on my own time, because it's something that I'd always heard Tolkien was inspired by.
Oh yeah.
But I had never really looked into the story that much myself. I had a vague idea of what it was about.
I read it back 15 years ago.
Yeah, but I didn't really look into it too much.
Yeah.
One of the criticisms of Beowulf, kind of for a long time actually, was that it did a lot of I don't know what you'd call it, it would deviate from the story to explain the cultural sort of context or some story about this god or that god or something like that.
Yeah.
It would constantly sort of divert from the story of Beowulf to fill out the world and the context that surrounded Beowulf and this culture here or this city, and it does a lot of deviations to fill in details like that.
I feel like in part Beowulf was influenced by Christianity a little bit, in a way that kind of changed what the original story would have been.
Sure.
So they kind of are trying to circumvent the Inquisition, which didn't come till later, I know, but they're trying not to offend the church at the time, while still telling this important story of their culture,
Yeah.
So that may lend to some of the oddities of the story.
What I had read is that a lot of people criticize it because it does all this deviating from the story to explain all this stuff that seems ancillary or not important to the story. Mm-hmm. And what people are sort of interpreting that as now is an attempt to lend historical authenticity to the story itself.
Oh, I see. So
Right.
they were trying to explain it as a literal historical event.
Right, to make the story feel like it has historical authenticity. Similar criticisms are made of the Lord of the Rings for all the songs. And like deviations from like the story to like explain this culture's language or whatever, or like how this land came to be.
More real. Yeah.
And you know, people might think that that's boring, and I'm not going to like fault you for feeling that way. But the purpose of it is not just, oh, I thought of all of this stuff, so I want to put it in the book because I worked so hard on it.
Right.
It is to add a sense of historical authenticity to the story. It feels like there's something that exists beyond just this immediate perspective we have of the person walking through this scene.
Yeah.
There's a world outside of it, outside of just these people. It feels bigger than just this scene we're looking at.
Yeah.
The world is alive. It is moving. There are cultures and people and things happening all over the place outside of just this scene. A lot of times, the scale of something can feel small when it's too focused just on what's happening here on screen, so to speak. Right?
Yep.
It doesn't feel like the world is alive around it. So you have to build that out somewhat, but obviously there's going to be different takes or subjective thoughts on how much is like worth doing.
Right.
But that was kind of the point of in both texts of doing that, was to kind of create this authenticity around the world and give it like a lived-in feel to it, right? Now, having been thinking about that recently, I feel like Senua is lending a sense of authenticity to the delusion she is living.
Interesting.
She is focused and doing all of these trials and like going into the world of these foreign gods and like being immersed in this world because to her it needs to be real.
Right.
And this might be getting a little ahead of myself, but the whole point is that she doesn't want to deal with the loss that she has suffered with the death of Dillion. She's not willing to accept that loss yet.
So in many ways, she's putting her own obstacles in front of herself.
She's creating a journey.
More things to do.
That keeps her having a goal, a purpose, something to aspire to, something to do, move. And the longer she's engaged in this, the longer she can delay the reality that Dillion can't be brought back.
Right.
So lending authenticity to the Norse gods and all of its history creates the sense that I can save Dillion from Helheim because Helheim is real and Hela is real and all of this stuff is real.
Yeah.
And so she's fixated on these stories and on building this world of the Norse gods and lending authenticity to it.
In her own way.
In her own mind.
That's actually a really cool parallel. I like that a lot.
That was like the sense that I got playing through it this time. It's like, what is the purpose of all of this stuff? Because what else is it for? Like, it's not necessarily related to Senua's journey, but it does create this whole world around her because she's going into, like you said, these are not her gods.
Yes.
She didn't grow up being told about Odin and Thor and Hela and Loki and Sigurd and all these characters. She doesn't know who they are. Druth knew them because he was a slave of the Vikings.
He taught them to her.
And he taught them to her. So she's cementing these stories
and
that
you know what's funny?
He told her in her mind.
Assuming these runes are the extent to which Druth told her all of this stuff, everything else that's not included in these specific stories, everything else is added in by her.
Yes.
Right. So every other thing that she's doing, every other thing that she sees, is you got a story that's one paragraph long, and she takes that paragraph and creates this big like world out of it.
Right.
Yeah.
And she creates trials to go through
you're right about
and
that.
like all of these things, like all these conflicts she has to face and overcome.
Who was it? He himself, Druth, ended up having to escape through fire in order to make his way and continue living. So then she has to then escape through fire.
Yeah.
And then there's a story about Odin, who has to sacrifice in order to read the runes, in order to understand the voice of the gods. And so she's got her own sacrifice. That's why it's called Senua's sacrifice, I believe, is because it's paralleling with Odin's story. Yeah. And so she's got to make some sacrifice so that she can then get what she wants from the gods, right? Yeah. And so but she has to make her own sacrifice, and she has to make it. She has to determine what it's going to be, right? For Odin, it was, here's my eye, and he hung himself from a tree upside down while stabbing himself with a spear for like 9 days while his blood dripped, and then he drank from the fountain of wisdom, and then the gods revealed to him the runes, right? But he had to give his eye first.
Right.
Anyway, so he kind of did that all. So she's making her own version of that. Yes. That this will be my sacrifice to the gods.
Yes.
And but she's making it. She has to make it herself.
Yeah, and a lot of this is influenced by the father who raised her, and we'll get way more into him later. Yeah. But he talks about in several lines that the suffering of life is like really important, right?
Yes.
Like the going through the suffering.
That's actually Nietzsche. That's a Nietzschean kind of argument. But
she grew up with that understanding that the sacrifice or the suffering is what's necessary. And now she's going into this land of foreign gods and trying to, as much as possible, believe that it is real. Because if it's real, then she can save Dillion. If it's not real, she has to accept his death. And she's not willing to do that yet. She has not reached a point where she can accept that.
Yeah.
So she is using all the stories to create a historical authenticity to the world she's creating in her mind.
Yeah. That makes sense.
I think it really works with the theme, too.
That does actually, and I really like that. I like that perspective.
Okay, so you meet Druth. He sort of, he comes, it's actually really cool the way they did this. They filmed actors. They're not like CG characters.
At first, I was like, that's good motion capture, right? But it's because he was kind of blurred, and you don't see him that well, and he's kind of, he's being edited into the scene in an interesting way, right? Yeah. So I thought it was just motion capture. I'm like, wow, they got his eyes really good.
Yeah.
It kind of made her motion capture not look so good. And then I realized it's a video. It's just a video. And there's something, I think this is from me growing up with games in the 90s.
Yeah.
But when I see video of live action people in a game, it lowers the value, the production value, my perceived quality of the level of the game gets lowered a little bit.
Yeah.
You used to see that in games a lot, where they'd put in video. And
I know the games you're talking about.
I never liked it. There are a lot of them, especially in the 90s. And games have really gotten away from that, in part because they don't need to. The graphics are good enough.
Yeah.
And this game put the video in, and I didn't know it was video at first. I thought I was fine with it. And once I realized it was video, it lowered the value of not the general value, but just the visual quality of what I was perceiving, because video is like a cheap trick to make your graphics seem like they look really good.
Yeah.
And the way that they I thought it was very interestingly done, but it nonetheless reminded me of why I don't really like video in my video games.
I think that this was probably a byproduct of the small scale of the game.
I know that. That's my point, actually. That's what I'm saying.
Right.
Is that, this was a cheap game made by low-budget people.
This wouldn't have been done this way had they had a $100 million budget or something. Right?
And you don't notice their lack of a budget until you see that they used video in their game, and then it just screams, we didn't have enough money to make this game at you. But that being said, it was well done. The actors were great, and it looks good. I just have this weird aversion to that.
They have a lot of filters and effects and things they use to try to blend it in together. You can, and
especially with her mother talking on the stones in the wall and elsewhere. The way that they track her face to the mouth and to the way everything kind of seems, and it just blends. It's just very well done.
Yeah. So anyways, she meets Druth here. He's like a spirit. So she says, it's good to see you again. You kept your vow. And he says, to guide you in this life and the next, I will tell you my stories of hell if I may walk with you. So it's like his spirit's going to guide her through Helheim.
Bringing him in.
Yeah, bringing her with him, or with her, bringing him with her. And he's going to act as her mentor or guide and kind of teach her about the things she's seeing and inform her about the Northmen's myths while she's experiencing them, right?
Yeah.
So you kind of go into this room where there's the door that opens up to the bridge leading into Helheim, and it's sealed. And it's sealed by two gods, Valravn and Surtr. And so she's going to have to go and defeat these gods in order to open this door and actually get in. But before that happens, we get introduced to the darkness, which is what she was told by her father is the curse that follows her around and makes her see all of these things and hear all of these things. And now it has infected her. So he told her that she was infected with a rot, with this darkness.
Yeah.
And it is infecting her arm. And they tried to make this into a mechanic in the game where every time you die, the rot spreads further.
Yeah.
And if it spreads all the way up to the head, then there's a permadeath that happens.
Yeah.
And Senua will permanently die. Your game is over. You have to start the game over again.
Yeah.
This is a lie.
Oh, really?
This mechanic does not exist in the game.
Oh, they just say that.
And this was a controversy
To
of
scare
the game.
you.
Yes.
I don't know if that's controversial. Games lie to you all the time.
Well, I'll tell you why. I guess other people felt this way. Early in the game, after Senua hand starts to rot because she got tainted, the darkness tells her that every time she dies, every death turns out to be a vision of a possible future, right? The rot will spread further up until it reaches her head and consumes her soul. The game implies that if this happens, it will result in a permadeath, as the player's save would be deleted, and all the game progress until then would be erased. However, several media outlets later found out that the rot stops spreading after a certain number of deaths and cannot progress further before a certain point in the game, ultimately making it impossible for it to reach Senua's head. Antoniadis said that the permadeath mechanic was a bluff. While the rot will spread on Senua's body over repeated deaths, it will never fully reach her head. The wording they chose to describe this was meant to convey part of the fear associated with mental illness and psychosis directly to the player. So some of these people, again, that we'll talk about in next episode, describe feeling like they're going to die, having this paranoia about death, and that this was, the idea of this was to invoke that sense in you, the player, like there's sort of this impending doom coming. If you're not careful, you're going to really die and lose your save progress and, have to start over again. That was like their attempt to do that. I think a lot of people felt it was kind of clumsy. So Reed McCarter of PC Gamer strongly defended Ninja Theory's move, calling it great game design, a modern expression of unreliable narration.
Yes, it was the unreliable narrator.
That's how I felt about it.
And that was my point when I say games do this all the time. This is a method of storytelling, is to give you a piece of information that's technically not true.
Yeah.
And I don't think it's a big deal.
So there were several outlets like PC Gamer and others that thought it was a clever decision, a cool trick.
I wouldn't go that far.
Yeah.
I don't think it was clever or cool. It's just a thing, and I don't care either way.
And some people really didn't like it, but I'll get into that in the criticism next time. But I at least wanted to bring up that this death mechanic is not real. It's a bluff that's meant to make you feel paranoid about it.
I actually wondered that when I first read that. I was like, really? You're going to force me? Oh, that's it. I thought it was interesting, but I did kind of question whether it was real, like even right then.
But this ends up happening. She ends up getting infected like this because she tries to bargain with the darkness. So like the darkness comes on her and she's like, "Oh, you took him from me. I beg you, let him go. I'll do whatever you want. I won't resist anymore." Because she's been resisting this darkness her whole life.
Yeah.
"I won't resist anymore. Just give him back." She's pleading and trying to like negotiate with the darkness, and then it affects her. It's like you don't bargain with the darkness. And that's what the narrator voice says. "Poor Senua, the darkness does not bargain. It does not reason. It is rot. and now it has taken hold, and it will spread towards her head, the seat of the soul, until there is nothing left of her.
Which is why she's holding the
Gillian's
skull.
head.
Yeah,
the
is because that's
yeah.
the seat of the soul, right? So
He's
it's
going
like,
to go
here's
get
the head.
his soul back from hell. I'm going to put it back into the head.
Yeah.
Right, is the idea.
But also, this is an interesting representation of the gods being something along the lines of, like, you're punished by the gods for doing certain things. The gods don't show favor upon you. Your life is a certain way because you offended the gods, right? By trying to bargain with the gods, you offended them and they smite you with a curse, and that is because you offended the gods. It's interesting when you put that in the context of a psychosis or an emotional situation, right? Where, Carl Jung would say something along the lines of that a god is something that rules your fate, right? Yeah. That there's principalities and things that could be considered demons or angels, but it rises to the level of a god when it controls your fate.
Yeah.
Right? And her fate is controlled by forces outside of her control. Yeah. And they can, in some definitions, accurately be referred to as gods.
Yeah.
And you have to treat the gods properly, even if you're going to say, well, the gods aren't real. It's like, for her, they are 100% real, and you have to treat them according to their rules, and because they govern your fate. Yeah. Anyways, it's just a different way of looking at it, I think.
Yeah, for sure. So as she proceeds, you go, again, you can do it in either order. Valravn or Surtr's trial first.
I did
right?
Valravn first.
I think in my playthrough I did Surtr first, but in a waterfall you see Senua's mother, and she explains how she also saw visions. So this sort of implies that this is a hereditary genetic thing that Senua inherited from her mother. I don't know how much at this time they would have. I mean, I'm sure they knew you inherit some traits from your parents, right?
They did.
Hair color, yes. And you look like.
I would say just general evolution, even if they didn't know scientifically, whatever. Animals deduce who would be the proper mate or how to best survive, and that natural selection has a way of taking people who aren't fit and removing them from the group, right? And it happens in a social situation with her father and everything, but it happens all through the animal kingdom. So I would say they for sure knew. In fact, there's a verse in the Bible that was there's the blind man, and then the Pharisees, I think, bring the blind man to Jesus, and they're saying, who sinned, this man or his father, that he be cursed with this
It's almost
situation.
Exactly the situation here. Yeah.
I think it was well understood going very far back that the children carry with them the what would you call it? The traits of the parents, the phenotypes, but also the sins of the parents and everything else. It's all inherited.
Right. So I suppose they probably would have suspected that she got this from her mother.
Especially when they practice things like shunning or ostracism.
Yeah.
That is with the express purpose of no longer including those genes in your gene pool.
Right.
Yeah. That's the social utility of that.
Her mother was this kind of priestess healer who also had hallucinations and voice hearing, that sort of thing. So she had psychosis. Father did not, and was also some kind of religious leader who was trying to purge his wife of this curse.
Now, I do wonder about this from a historical point of view.
Yeah.
I feel like that may be putting a little too much of modernity onto the history.
Whether he would have married somebody who...
whether she would have gotten married first of all, yes, that's a big question. Although certain forms of psychosis don't manifest till after your 20s. Like sometimes people with schizophrenia, it's onset at like 25.
That's what they imply for Senua. It's
that it
late
came later.
Teens, early 20s, that she really started to... The darkness really started to take
that's
hold,
common.
Right?
I think that's common. And that is common with things like depression and other things as well.
So maybe her mother...
puberty.
Started exhibiting these things after later. She was married.
Because remember, 800 AD, people got married. Girls got married when they were like 13.
Really young.
Yeah, that's when you get married, right? So she could even be a grandmother by the time she all of a sudden starts getting these symptoms of schizophrenia or something like that, right? Because sometimes it can happen that late. But also, what was it? Hold on. I had another thing. I had the other thing. So it comes on late. Oh, the other idea. So there's a book called, it's written by Mircea Eliade, and it's called The Sacred and the Profane. But he also wrote a book just called Shamanism, just in general. It was people like this who would often be seen as shamans in a tribe.
Yeah.
Not in the negative sense, that they would be, I don't think this was always, and so, it's possible something like this would still have happened. But often shamans of a tribe would be people who exhibited hallucination type, what would you call it? They would see hallucinations, right? People who were like this were sometimes, though not always, considered prophetic. And if this woman had been around for this long, had children, and was part of the religious tradition, would they have ostracized her for having hallucinations of this sort or of any sort? Shamans typically tended to do drugs in order to elicit these types of hallucinations.
Oh, sure.
Like they would often try to have these visions, and the people would often defer to them and leave them alone while they were having an episode of sorts. So anyways,
Yeah.
I don't know 100% that that's for sure what would have happened in this situation, but I do feel like if that were to happen today or maybe 200 years ago, that this would be an accurate thing that would have happened. Then the husband would come in and, no, this isn't right. But I don't know if that's accurate to 1,000 years ago and how things worked back then, especially with the shamanic tradition. So anyways, I'm not criticizing and saying I know better. I'm just questioning how accurate that is historically.
I took down this line here. Hell will not give you the answers you want, but you mustn't look away from the horror it does offer, because you cannot overcome suffering if you refuse to look at it.
Okay.
So this is the idea about the suffering being a requirement.
Yes. It's exposure therapy.
Yeah.
Right? Mm-hmm. You have to, if you're afraid of snakes and it's ruining your life, you have to not be afraid of snakes now. So you will see a psychologist who will then help you see snakes and get closer to them. And by exposure to the thing, you learn to not be afraid of it after a while. This is how you treat people with agoraphobia and all sorts of things. So there's also the idea that the brass serpent was this kind of situation, that you search for the meaning in the suffering. I'm reading the wrong line here.
It's
you cannot overcome suffering if you refuse to look at it.
Yeah.
That in part is the brass serpent of Exodus, or I think it's in Numbers actually, but in the Bible, the story of the brass serpent that Moses puts it up, and there's a plague and the snakes are hurting the people, and what do we do about this? These snakes are infecting our society, and there's a problem, right? So Moses gets a brass serpent and says, look at this, look at it.
Yeah.
And people stare at it. And the idea being that if you look long enough and if you look hard enough at the thing that will kill you, at death, if you look at death and stare it down and look at it long enough and hard enough and really contemplate it, you will find the antidote to be found there. Just like the yin and yang, there's a little circle within each side that has the opposite. If you look into the darkness long enough, eventually you'll find that point, the light. You'll see the light, and if you focus on the light, and if you look hard enough, it begins to grow until eventually it consumes the darkness and you're left with nothing but light, right? And that's the idea of like focusing on death. And that's would also be likely the connection between the brass serpent of the Old Testament and then Christ on the cross, right?
Sure.
You look at you focus on the cross, you look at the death, and from that you find the life and the resurrection and all of that stuff. So
right. Let's see. Druth goes on to say here, the Northmen made fire sacrifices, burning slaves like me, to reveal the path to Surtr. I searched for meaning in their suffering, in their eyes, but they just screamed like helpless pigs. So the Vikings were going around burning people, making sacrifices to their god Surtr. And so Senua has to go through several fire trials here. Kind of like you said, passing through the fire kind of a thing.
And I think one of the stories that we hear from the guy, I'm bad with names anyways, Druth, is his story about passing through fire. Yeah. And it's around this time that we learn about that story. But it's a rebirth story. This is the beauty to be found here. It's a rebirth story. So He talks about how he even got a new name after he went through this trial. He used to be Finden. He used to be Finden, but once he went through this situation, and it's a baptism by fire kind of situation, because baptism represents a rebirth. But he had to
It's so funny because it goes right into this quote.
Oh, perfect. Well, this is great. So he had to pass through the fire where he essentially died and was reborn. He was baptized through the fire into a new life where he chose for himself a new name, and he then became Druth. And as he was reborn with a new lease on life and ready to do anything, he chose to live a different kind of life than he was living previously.
Right.
But the same thing happens with her. So she runs through the fire, and by the end, because I think you have to do it multiple times.
Burns.
By the end, she burns, but what happens when she's on the ground burnt? It slowly peels away, and I think there's even text on screen. Someone's talking to her saying, you have been reborn. Through this process, you are now reborn. You are a new person, and you're a better person, and you can choose your own fate.
And that's when she fights Surtr and defeats him.
Yeah.
And the quote from the narrator after that, after you've defeated Surtr, is, have you ever died before?
There you go.
It's a serious question. When the illusion of self is shattered, you simply cease to be. Though it may not seem that way to others, you know when it is true. You can feel it, a stranger in your own body, an imposter, and nothing is the same ever again. Senua died before, and she will do so again. You can be sure of that.
Yes. Yep. That quote comes up again later, I swear. Yeah, Senua has died, and she will do so yet again. I can assure you of that.
Yeah.
Beautiful, beautiful line. She is constantly dying. This is her life. She is constantly in a state of dying and being reborn.
Yes.
But through fire, which is the symbol of fire in the runes, in the ancient Norse runes, the symbol for fire actually means transformation, right?
Yeah.
And because the fire is what you use to turn iron ore into a sword, And so fire being transformation, as she passes through the fire, she literally transforms.
Right.
And I think those are the runes that you collect during that process too, are the runes for fire.
Right.
And
yeah,
so,
exactly.
But this is constant for her. She's constantly dying. And I think this is true for everybody. We're constantly letting our former selves die and are allowing ourselves to be remade in a new way going forward, over and over, all the time.
Right.
That's just a metaphor for life in some ways.
Yeah. So that pretty much wraps up the trials of Surtr and the battle against Surtr.
Yeah.
Next is Valravn, which I really like this section of the game. I think Valravn is just a very cool god.
Yeah, pretty cool.
Like a god of illusions.
Sure, yes, illusion. And it's interesting that we fight that god first.
Yeah.
You would think that would be one of the later gods, right?
Yeah.
Because if she's going to overcome if she's going to conquer the illusion, right, you would think that after conquering the illusions that she can now no longer be subject to them. They no longer rule her fate. The god of the illusions is no longer one that binds her and subjects her. But she's still clearly seeing illusions throughout the entire game. So I don't know if it's saying what I thought it was saying. I thought that it was telling us that she was overcoming the illusions, the way that she overcame the fire. But I feel like it must be saying something else, because she's definitely still, subject to the fate of the god of illusions, let's say.
Right.
Yeah.
So, I put this note here. This is pretty similar to what I was saying earlier, but all these rituals and trials and mythology and pareidolia puzzles are distractions, a subconscious diversion to give herself a purpose and a goal to work toward and delay having to accept that Dillion is gone. It's just like she's
interesting
pushing
way to look
that thing further, not consciously.
Subconsciously.
Yes. Pushing that moment where she's going to have to deal with that further and further and further down by creating with stimuli that she's legitimately having and has had all her life. All the hallucinations and the voice hearing and all these things she sees, right? All of this is being used to create this world of the gods of the Northmen. Mm-hmm. And having to battle through this is just kicking the can down the road further and further and further to not have to actually deal with the problem she's going to have to deal with.
Right.
And it keeps her mind occupied, and it keeps her coming through suffering and a noble goal and overcoming and like feeling like she's progressing and moving. It's all an avoidance of acceptance of reality.
I think there's something to that, especially as she tries to cross this bridge here.
Yeah.
Essentially, it's that she knows she's not ready.
Yeah.
And so she allows herself to be defeated by her own unconscious mind.
Yes.
And it's an interesting way to look at things. People do this all the time, by the way, but it's just more obvious in someone who has psychosis.
Yeah.
That they are creating their biggest obstacles, but it's not so obvious. People do that all the time.
Right. And again, the creativity part of the mind being like
hyperactive,
active, right? They are literally creating this. This is not something like malfunctioning. It's hyper-functioning. Mm-hmm. But they're not in control of it.
Yeah, yeah.
So, yeah, anyways, fascinating stuff. But
well, I really like the perspective stuff because in part she has taught herself, or this is a truth of the world, which either one is acceptable, I think, that what she needs to do to progress in life is to find a different perspective, right? To go somewhere else and to pick a different way of looking at things until she can find what she's looking for, essentially. And I think that's still compatible with what you're saying.
Right.
But at the same time, she needs to find validation in nature.
Yes.
So she's like, I need to do this thing. I think I need to do this thing. So let me go out and experiment on my hypothesis and see if that's correct. And lo and behold, the tree fell, and then this tree's here. And if I stand here, I can see the symbol. So that means that my hypothesis is correct. Yep. That's what she would conclude from that. The hypothesis was correct, that I need to find this symbol in the world.
Yeah.
And that keeps it going. Yeah.
So while she's doing these illusion puzzles and trying to work her way through this labyrinth of Valravn, right? There's a lot of narration here that details her time in the wilds and as a Gelt and meeting Druth and almost giving into the darkness, but Dillion's words bringing her back. A lot of these details about her background are sort of like filled in here. She was exiled. She was blamed for a lot of the plagues and things.
I put a whole thing there for that.
Yeah, because of her curse, right? Everyone believed that she was cursed.
There was a plague in the village, and because she was cursed. And the word plague doesn't mean today, in 2022, what it meant a long time ago. In fact, I threw up a couple definitions of the word plague. So in Old French, a plague means affliction, calamity, evil, scourge, severe trouble, or vexation. And then in Swedish, which is a Scandinavian language, plague, plaga, means curse, torment, pain, terror, worry, etc. Things like that.
Yeah.
So when people say there's a plague in our city, they're not necessarily, they could be, but they're not necessarily referring to a pox or COVID.
Like a disease.
Yeah, they're not referring to a disease necessarily. It could be, but it could also be a cultural rot. Like something has seeped into our culture that is destroying it from within. And this is where René Girard, he has a lot to say about this. Do we want to talk about the plague thing now, or is that something that comes up later?
Well, it does come up a little bit later because there's that whole trial of that swampy part that comes a little bit later.
So I can
one
do
of the
this
trials
later.
of Odin. So let's talk about it in the trials
perfect.
of Odin.
One of the four.
Anyways, it details her promise that she made to Dillion, right? Because she's like, I'm going to leave. I'm going to go in the wilds. He's like, no, trying to dissuade her from doing it. But he's like, okay, if you're going to go, you got to promise me that you'll come back. And so she makes the promise, and that's what keeps her going and fighting the darkness and not giving into it. And then she meets Druth out there. Now, Druth tells his whole story to her right as before you get to the fight with Valravn, right? His father sent him to pay for his sister's release, who had been captured by the Northmen. They take his money and put him in captivity for 1 day, then they release him. He goes back. His father's enemies had raided and killed his father and his brother, and then they pretended to be giving recompense to him for this, but then they betray him and turn him over to the Vikings, and they enslave him for a long time. But through fire, he escaped. His whole baptism by fire thing happened. He became a different person. He talks about how he was a coward, right? But he never saw his sister again, he says. And though Findon never set eyes on his sister again, I, Druth, have found you, Senua. So he almost saw her like a little sister, right, while he was out there in the wilds with her.
I see.
So as she's working her way around there and hearing all these stories, she breaks the seal of Valravn, and then darkness overtakes her, and Valravn lunges at her, and she sort of loses consciousness. And when she wakes up, she's in the dark. She doesn't understand what's going on, but she's being pecked at by Valravn
yes.
in the background.
Yes.
And it's like she's being eaten alive, right, by this raven god.
And she feels so helpless.
She's losing.
Because the god of illusion holds that much power over
Yes.
her. She can do
Right.
nothing, and she just lays there helpless while it is eating her.
Yes.
There's like great symbolism in that.
And she's like losing her resolve. She's giving in to the darkness, but she hears Druth calling to her. First the narrator's, I think, talking to us. I'm still here. Are you too? Where are we? Oh, I remember. It didn't end well in the wilds. It never does. She had encountered Valravn in her wilds
previously.
experience.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Right? So, and she kind of speaks directly to him. So
Because it never does.
obviously,
so this
when she heard about Valravn, probably from Druth himself in her time with,
It became
she
a thing.
started to hallucinate Valravn in the wilds, right?
Interesting.
So she had encountered this. This is the one god she had encountered before.
And it's the god of illusion. So this is
Yeah.
one that ruled her fates.
Exactly.
That's interesting.
It didn't end well. It didn't end well in the wilds. It never does. You think you can overcome the darkness, make sense of it, and once relief settles in, it strikes out of nowhere, throwing you helplessly back into the maelstrom, drowning the mind in fear, deeper, deeper, dragging you down so far into the void that maybe this time there is no coming back. But there in the darkness, she remembered what he told her. And then Druth is, Senua, hear me, reach out to me. Senua, like, take the iron mirror. So this is where you get this mirror, right?
Yes,
It gives
yes.
you some abilities in the
That's
combat and
right,
things
yeah.
like that. Look into it. It's a window into the underworld. Within, you'll see the face of the darkness that you fear. And if you focus, like you were talking about, like I have taught you to, you will also see that as much as the darkness has trapped you within its veil, it too is trapped within yours. Focus, focus, focus. And then she's able to break the darkness, and she has the fight with Valravn, and she says, I see you now. You led me into the wilds, and you trapped me there. I never beat you in the wilds, did I? It was an illusion, but not this time. And this fight's really cool. I think it's actually my favorite fight in the game against Valravn.
Well, the way we end up dispatching him is pretty
so
sweet.
it's really cool.
Just like knock him on the ground and then stab him through the mouth. Just like
just the I don't know, just the flow of it. He'll like disappear and then like appear over here and like lunge at you, and then he's like throwing stuff and you deflect it back at him, and it's just a really dynamic fight. It's a really fun fight. And Valravn itself is just a very cool design.
Oh, very cool, yeah.
This is one of my favorite sections of the game. The whole Valravn part is just awesome. It's dope. But she finishes it off, right? Kills it. And both of the seals are now released so that the doors to Helheim can be opened. The doors to hell.
Yes.
And there's an important line from the narrator here. She says, in those dark winter nights in the wilds, there were times when she considered letting go. If it weren't for Druth, a chance encounter in the wild, she would not have heard his stories of the Northmen, and she would not have had this chance to find Dillion's soul.
There you go.
She almost let go. She almost accepted. She almost gave in. But Druth telling her all the stories of the gods and the Northmen
gave her hope.
Gave her an idea that she has held on to and is now making real in her mind, right? It's like, anyways, I thought that was really nice, like foreshadowing to the theme of the game, right?
Yeah.
On the way out, she sees her mother's face again. She taught Senua to see the weave that binds the world together, and it was beautiful. It was a time before the darkness, but when it did come, it came first for her mother. Senua still sees her face from time to time, hidden in the world, like she is still watching over her. She misses her so much. So her this is where it's revealed that her mother died. She was overtaken by the same curse or the same darkness, right?
But they're saying it came first for her, so that is a late onset.
Yes.
Of the symptoms.
Right.
And I just love that she sees her mother in nature, which is, I mean, correct in terms of the human experience of the dichotomy of the male-female, masculine-feminine way of seeing the world. And then her father is the tyrannical force in her mind, something along the lines of a superego that is, she has to overcome. And that is also accurate to, the role of a father historically and where she would likely have put those two positions. And I think it's beautiful. I think it's very well done.
Yeah. So this is the point where you can open the doors and cross the bridge, but this is where we said we were going to stop for today. So that's it for this week. Join us again next time, and we'll finish our sort of like analysis and summary of the game, and then we'll get into some discussion about, whether or not this depiction of mental illness was
perfectly
well done,
accurate and
all that,
or whether or not it warrants death threats.
We'll
We'll work through that. I don't know.
We'll talk about that next time. Thanks, everybody. Peace out. Have a good week.